Hey guys, I'm Nashwa. Welcome back to my channel, and this video will be a reading wrap up for all the books that I've read in the month of August and a couple of them that have spilled into the month of September. Most of these are Pakistani books, but I will be talking about one Indian book that I actually finished a couple of days ago. So previously in August, I made a video where I was talking about the fact that I wanted to improve my relationship with Pakistani fiction. And I made a TBR and I decided to read 4 books that month. But I also deviated from my TBR a little bit and I picked up other Pakistani books. So I actually ended up reading, I think it's a total of, if I can do the math right, yes, these are 7 physical books that I read. And I also listened to 1 audiobook. And the journey has been a little up and down. It has its highs and lows. I had a 1-star read, I had a 2-star read, I had 3 3-stars read, 3 stars read, I had a 4-star read, and I had 2 5-star reads, which is something that's really amazing. So let me start with the 1-star read, and this is a book called This Wide Night by Sarvat Hasin. And as with all my wrap-ups, I have my computer open in front of me so I can refer to my Goodreads review, because I've been writing detailed Goodreads reviews because I happen to have a faulty memory when it comes to talking about books. But this is a book that I rated 1 star, and it's basically pitched as The Virgin Suicides meets Little Women. Now, I haven't read The Little Women, but The Virgin Suicides was one of my favorite books growing up because it was dark, it was mysterious, it was tragic, and it was creepy. And this book is basically about these 4 sisters, and their story is being told from the perspective of their neighbor who lives across the street from them. And from the get-go, this book did all the cringy things that it wasn't supposed to do, or I wasn't expecting it, because on page 7, we find out that the neighbor, the guy who lives across from the girls, he is half French, and one of the girls ends up saying that, "Oh, you're so exotic." And that sort of like bothered me from page 7, but I kept on reading. And the author has this style of writing which comes across as very pretentious, and there's a scene in which she actually writes that the girl walks into a classroom and she is womanliness pouring into the classroom, and she is compared to slow honey, and that really bothered me because the writing style wasn't very compact. Other than that, this book does not seem to be edited, because not only were there grammatical mistakes and typos, there were sentences that actually had missing words in it, and that really put me off, because this book is published by Penguin, and I don't know how Penguin actually got away with publishing a book with so many typos. But the plot was really strange because a lot of weird things happened. The author tried so hard to make the 4 girls, the 4 sisters, really mysterious and creepy. The author kept saying that these girls were mysterious, they were not like other girls, without really telling us what was different about them. And the differences that she sought out weren't really that, I don't know, it didn't really make them that different, because these girls were supposed to be different because they like to read, they like to paint, they like to write, and that just gives them hobbies. That doesn't really add an aura of mysteriousness. Another thing that this author did was that she added the suicide of a random character, a character that we don't know of, we don't hear of him. He comes on the page, then he dies, then he goes away, and that's basically used to propel the plot forward, which is something that I absolutely despise in books. So overall, it was a pretty poor book in my opinion, and I've decided to unhaul it at a later point, but I will refer to my Goodreads review to see in case I have missed anything. Another thing that this author did was that she used the 1971 Pakistan Civil War, which eventually led to the creation of Bangladesh, as a plot point to move the plot along. She didn't really consider the social impact of it. She didn't really consider any, I don't know, impact on the soldiers and their families, other than from a perspective which was very far removed. Like the girl's father, he loses his leg in the war. And I feel like that's a pretty traumatizing experience, but we just see that he lost his leg and then we move on to the girls. So overall, I think the author had an opportunity to talk about social commentary and give us the perspective of 4 women, 4 single women supposedly living in a society in the 70s, but it didn't really do any of that, and it was just not good. The next book I'm going to talk about is called The Reluctant Fundamentalist by Mohsin Hamid, and I had previously mentioned that I don't like Mohsin Hamid's work, and I was proven right, because I feel like everyone was telling me that Moth Smoke is great, but I didn't really agree with that. But then they were like, you should read Exit West, and I didn't like that. And then they're like, you should read The Reluctant Fundamentalist, it will change your mind about him. And I read the book. It's a library book, so luckily I don't own it, it will go back, but I ended up giving it 2 stars. Now, in my opinion, this is one of those books that's pretentious, but it's tolerable in very small doses. So you have to be really patient with it, and the way that I read it, I would read no more than 2 chapters a day. So even this book is like 200 pages or less. It took me about, I think, a week and a half, about 10 days to read this book because I was reading it very, very slowly. And I honestly didn't like it because the writing style seemed to be something that was heavily inspired by other writers. And I was talking to another booktuber and she told me that it seems to be a rip-off of The Fall. Now, I haven't read The Fall by Albert Camus, but I've heard that it's written in the exact same style. But other than that, I didn't find the book engaging. The plot is just very all over the place, and also like it doesn't seem very realistic to walk up to a man and tell him your entire life story, because that's what happens in the book. And the man on the other end, who happens to be an American tourist or a CIA agent, whatever your interpretation of the ending is, he's patient enough to listen to this. And then of course we have the troubled girl with the tragic past, and she's the elusive like love of his life, and I just found that to be exhausting. So this was not a great read. I'm glad I read it, in the sense that now if people tell me to check out the book, I will say I did and I didn't like it. But I don't think it improved my relationship with Mohsin Hamid. The next book that I finished is called Rafina by Shandana Minhas, which is a novella. And honestly, I was really nervous about this book. I thought I would end up hating it because the overall ratings on Goodreads seems to be 2.80. So it's less than 3 stars, and I was really nervous. I thought I wouldn't like it, but surprisingly I actually ended up liking it and giving it 3 stars, and I just found it refreshing. So this book is basically about a girl called Rafina, and she's very poor and she lives with her mother and her brother. Her father passes away, so she is living in poverty, and she is living in a very poor part of the country, and she wants to be a model. So she ends up working with her mother's friend at a beauty parlor, which is a salon, and she has big dreams of becoming a model, and the salon usually has like models come in for the shoots and everything. So like she gets to see a glimpse of that lifestyle and she wants it for herself. So one of the reasons that I really liked this book was because the main character Rafina is supposed to be 17 years old, and she actually sounded like a 17-year-old teenager. She sounded like a young character who had all the obsessions and worries of a young person. And just the way that she talked and expressed herself about other people's looks, about like boys that she was obsessed with, about the kind of life that she wanted for herself, it sounded very, very authentic, and that's something that I really liked about it. Another thing that I really liked about this book was the fact that it takes into consideration the obsession with the beauty parlor and the salon culture, of this obsession with looking perfect all the time, because all these women are coming into the salon to get beautified or like look presentable, and Rafina and the mother's friend end up going to people's houses to sort of like make them presentable, do their threading, do their waxing and everything. And I just thought that it gave really good social commentary. Not only that, they talk about income disparity, of how the supposedly rich and educated people actually think and talk, and in few instances it actually talks about colorism, because Rafina is quite dark, and there are these rich educated ladies who come to the salon and they're like, yeah, she's pretty, she's tall, she's skinny, but like she won't become a model because she's too dark. So I think the author gave us a lot of like good commentary on this culture of looking good, of this obsession that we have. I thought that aspect was done really well. The only thing that didn't really work for me in this book was the ending, and I feel like because it's a novella, it didn't have enough time to develop, and the underdeveloped ending really put me off. And on the very last page, in the very last paragraph, the author does something that I usually don't like in books, which is add explicit sexual content to make it more shocking. And I feel like the book could have done without that, because that's just in the very last page. So while the ending was a little bit iffy for me and I wasn't really connecting to that, I thought it was a good book in terms of all the other things that it had to offer. The next book that I finished is called Our Lady of Alice Bhatti by Muhammad Hanif. And Muhammad Hanif is an author who I've read before. I read A Case of Exploding Mangoes a couple of years ago, and unfortunately that book wasn't for me. I ended up giving it 2 stars because it was very scattered and I didn't like the humor in it, even though a lot of people appreciate it for that reason. But this book, I was really impressed with it. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars, and if only Goodreads allowed me to give it that half star more. It was really interesting because it talks about the Christian minority in Pakistan, which is a subject that a lot of authors haven't really talked about. And historically, they've been at a disadvantage because they've always been very poor and they usually work in blue-collar jobs. So this is the story of Alice, who is in prison, and when she gets free from prison, she goes to a hospital to apply for a job as a nurse, and then we basically follow her journey, how she's treated, how she treats patients. Really interesting story. Hanif's writing is very sharp. His observations about Pakistan, the Christian community, the Muslim community are very sharp and well written. The characters really come alive on the page, because not only do we have Alice as the main character, but we have another character in the book called Sister Hina Alvi, who's also a nurse at the same hospital, and she's also a really well crafted female character. Hanif also comments on how women are treated in general. He talks about harassment and all these other issues that women have to face. So overall, I really enjoyed this book, even though I thought that I wouldn't give Muhammad Hanif another chance. I disliked the first book, but I'm really glad I actually picked it up. The next book that I'll talk about is called The Bride by Bapsi Sidhwa. I have a detailed discussion for this book on my channel, which I did with Paulina from Super Pau, and this is a Bapsi Sidhwa book, and I gave it 4 stars. So it basically tells the story of this man called Qasim, and he is from the northern areas of Pakistan, which are the mountains and the colder regions. They have their own traditions and customs, and that's the life that they live by. And it's set during the time of partition, so you can almost consider it a companion novel to Cracking India. As the story is set during the partition, Qasim basically comes across a younger girl called Zaitoon, whose parents have been murdered on the trains which were coming from India to Pakistan, and they were usually attacked by the people of different religions. So he comes across this Muslim girl called Zaitoon, he adopts her, and then it's the story of how their life progresses. So half of it is set in the city of Lahore, which is in the plains, and the rest of it is set in the tribal areas or the mountains, where they have their own customs and their own traditions. So I found it really, really interesting because it was a buddy read. It adds that element of more discussion to it, and I feel like I'm just overall very impressed with Sidhwa's writing, because she hasn't really lived through some of these experiences but still writes about them really well, and in other instances you can tell that she's lived through them and she writes about them. So I just really liked this book. I liked it for the writing, the characterization. I liked how much I learned about Pakistan from it, because aside from the history books and everything, this also adds an element of educating you and entertaining you at the same time. I will say that this is one of Sidhwa's more serious works, so you won't find it funny, but definitely the suspense, the drama, the thrilling aspect of it is all there. So the next 2 books are basically non-fiction, and they're both 5-star reads for me. So I don't know if I'm more biased towards non-fiction books, but they were just done really well. The first one that I'm going to talk about is called Greetings from Berry Park by Sarfraz Manzoor, and I'm honestly not sure if this counts as a Pakistani book or if this counts as a British Pakistani book, because the author migrated to England with his family at the age of 3. So while he was born in Pakistan, he spent the rest of his life in England with his parents and his family. So he considers himself as a British Pakistani journalist, and I consider him as a Pakistani writer, but throughout this book he's basically confused with his identity, and that's why I think it's kind of fair for me to be confused about which category to put it in. So basically this is a memoir of him growing up. It tackles multiple aspects in terms of identity, which is where you belong from, because his parents wanted him to associate as a Pakistani while he was growing up in the UK. The author was basically growing up in the UK in the 70s and the 80s, a time which was extremely ignorant and racist, and every day he had a lot of derogatory terms thrown at him, whether it was at school, whether it was his class fellows, whether people he ran into. And it basically handles the question of racism really well, because he also talks about his experience during the 9/11 attacks and when the London bombings happened, because he was in his 30s by then, and that was the first time when he experienced racism that openly towards himself. It also talks about his religious identity, where he chooses to place himself, because growing up in a different country is very strange. But one of the best things about this book, and I think that's why I liked it more, was because he talks about his musical influences and how they changed his life. And this book is basically an ode and a thank you to his favorite musician, who happens to be Bruce Springsteen. And it's just the idea of music giving him some space and a sense of belonging and really, really relating to the lyrics. I just found that aspect to be very interesting. So this has been turned into a movie, which is not exactly the same thing, because the author wrote the movie but he fictionalized it more, and this is more of a memoir. So there is a movie that I watched and I really like, and this is one of those memoirs that I related to, which is really strange, because I have never lived anywhere outside of Pakistan. I've always lived here, grew up here for as long as I've been alive, but he migrated at the age of 3. So the question of religion and identity feels very strange that I can relate to it. Some of the ideas that growing up in a time which is changing, like how do we associate with our parents, how do we relate to our siblings, and of course he talks about his family, because it's his family story too, and that's another aspect that I really enjoyed about this book, so I gave it 5 stars. The next book I read is called Points of Entry by Nadeem Farooq Paracha, and it's basically a book of essays about Pakistan's history. And I took a really long time reading it, because there's like 17 essays in it and I really wanted to take them in. But the author makes the history very palatable, in the beginning of the book, he basically adds a timeline of all the major events that happened from 1947 when Pakistan came into being up until 2018. So it was a very refreshing start, because he basically reminded you of all the things that you might have forgotten in recent history and in the not so recent history. And I really enjoyed it because his style is very anecdotal and it's very entertaining, and he explains things really well. But it's also part of his like travel log and him drawing from his own experiences. And I feel like if you're interested in Pakistani history as a Pakistani, there are things in this book that you will never have heard of before. And I feel like it should almost be something that should be, you know, a rite of passage for you to know about these things, because he talks about, you know, the historical places, how they used to be occupied by different people, different religions, even before the British colonization, because he talks about the Mughal Empire. He talks about identity in terms of dress, that Pakistan used to be a very progressive country back in the 60s, and then we had a few government changes which really changed things for us. He talks about the music aspect, which again I really liked, because before the 70s we had a whole culture of music that was largely very Christian, but then again we had a few policy changes and a government changes, and then our nightclubs were shut down, and basically everything that was supposedly non-Islamic was, you know, not handled well, and, you know, the bars were shut down and things like that happened. So basically what this book did for me was that it made me nostalgic for a time of history that I haven't seen. And that's so strange, because the culture and the music and the whole idea of Pakistan and the identity of a nation, the way that he talks about it in the early 60s, 70s, even up till like 1975, it was an entirely different country. So it's something that I would kind of like to experience, and hopefully one day we'll reach economic prosperity where we won't have as many problems. And it's just that there are so many negative things affiliated with our country that this book was just like fun to read. And the last Pakistani book I'm going to talk about is one that I listened to, but I listened to it in Urdu, and this was basically a book called Chacha, Kinam, Kuch, and it's written by one of the most prolific Urdu writers that we have, whose name is Saadat, Hasan, Manto, and his books have been translated into a lot of languages. So if you're curious, you'll probably find some of his short stories in English. They sell in Pakistan too, because his work has been so widely translated, and because the Urdu that I speak on a daily basis outside my house is very watered down compared to the language that's used in this book, I found it very refreshing, because, you know, there are words in it that I've, you know, forgotten, and I've forgotten how nice Urdu literature is. So in this book, it's basically political satire, and he talks about all of the things that were happening during his time, and he talks about these things in a series of letters which he is writing to his uncle Sam, which is obviously a metaphor for the USA. And in these letters he talks about a lot of things. He tackles the issue of censorship, the poor quality of alcohol in Pakistan, and how sending Hollywood actresses to Pakistan would really help. But he also talks about the hypocrisy of the American policy when it comes to sending countries aid, but also like bombing other countries. So it's satire, it's political, and it made me very, very interested to read more of Manto's work, especially in Urdu, because I really enjoyed this audiobook. So what I've decided to do is that I'll go to my library and I'll get a physical book and I listen to the audiobook so my Urdu improves, because it sounds strange, but I haven't read an Urdu book in at least 10 years. And it's because after high school we're not really required to read or write any Urdu. Our entire university is in English, and our entire like professional life is conducted in English. So it feels like a great disconnect that I have with Urdu literature, and I'm very excited to read more of Manto's work. And the last book that I'll talk about in this video is called A Burning by Megha Majumdar. This is actually a new release, and it's an Indian contemporary book. I was lucky enough to buddy read this with BooksandKi, who happens to be an Indian booktuber. So even though Indian literature I thought would be easy for me to absorb, it was definitely very helpful to have insight from someone who actually lives in that country and share her experiences and her analysis of the story. So Ki and I will do a detailed discussion on this, because it will be a collaborative video. So keep an eye out for that, because it will be posted sometime soon. It's basically about a girl called Jeevan, who is a Muslim girl in India, and she is basically charged with a heinous terrorist act. And this is happening in a climate where there is an increase of fanaticism and there is a discrimination against other religions. And there are two other characters in it. We have a transgender called Lovely, who is growing up in poverty and she aspires to be a big actress. And then we have a character called PT Sir. So this book is very political in its themes. We see poverty, we see income disparity, we see classism, colorism, and we see political ambition. So overall, it's a great setup, but I had a few issues with it, and I ended up giving this book 3 stars. And my issues with it are not huge, but I feel like the pacing of this book is really off because some of the arcs are developing really nicely, but some of them are really slow, especially the main character, because sometimes we get a lot of backstory and not enough of the current, whatever is happening during the current time, and other stories are just happening really quickly. And it's just a very strange mix of being a very, very grim story, but also being a quick read because of the short chapters. So the author uses a tactic of differentiating between different characters using different styles of writing or speaking. So the character of Lovely basically uses broken English in her chapters, and that's how we hear her voice and that's how she talks. So I think while that is very clever and it shows a difference between education levels and probably more poverty and more being towards a spectrum which is very poor, I think it's something that will also alienate a lot of Western readers, because I feel like they wouldn't be able to pick up on the nuance of it. But I just found like this book to be strange. So while I think it's a good debut, this is definitely not the strongest book that I read. So that is my wrap up. I read a total of 9 books between the 1st of August and whatever date it is today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.